I'm very excited about this interview with Jewish convert Jason Olson and Palestinian convert Jabra Ghneim. They will each be giving their perspectives on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with a Latter-day Saint angle. You're going to learn a lot in this interview. Before we get started, I want to talk about our sponsor, Scripture Notes. This is the product that I use for all of my scripture study. You can see here something I'm working on right now is visions. I've got 1 Nephi, chapter 1, chapter 11, and then the Joseph Smith translation of chapter 1 of Genesis up here. I'm looking at them simultaneously, 3 different chapters at one time. I can cross-reference these things, put them into a collection note. Everything about this product is transformational. It's like putting your scripture study on steroids. Go to scripturenotes.com. That's scripturenotes.com and check it out. Here we go. All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we have Jabra Ghneim and Jason Olson, an LDS Palestinian and an LDS Jew. They're going to discuss maybe a little debate, maybe a little commonality on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that we are all paying very close attention to. Jabra and Jason, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Greg.
you.
I'd like each of you to introduce yourself a little bit, just very briefly, give a little bit of background on where you're coming from here, so that as we listen to what you have to say, we have an understanding of kind of the sourcing of this. Jabra, will you start? A little background on yourself?
Sure. So, Greg, thank you again for having me here. So, I'm basically a member of the church. I'm Arab, I'm Palestinian, I'm what's called the diaspora Palestinian. I grew up outside of Palestine. I grew up in Kuwait. My father left there in 59, hoping to save some money and then get back to Beit Jala, which is our hometown. And of course, the Six-Day War happened and he couldn't get back. So I ended up being born in Kuwait and grew up in Kuwait. In 86, we left Kuwait and went to Jordan I went to Jordan to get my college degree, and there I met the church. It wasn't recognized in Jordan, and in 89 I met the church in 88, but I couldn't get baptized until 1990 when the church was recognized, and we were allowed to baptize Christians if they asked to join the church. I was the first Jordanian, to join the church in Jordan when that happened, and we baptized there. I later came to BYU, did my master's degree, and went back to the Middle East and worked for the church as a translator and interpreter, and I did other things in media there, but mainly translating for the church until September 11th happened, and my wife, who's from Utah, the economy tanked and we didn't feel safe and we knew war would happen. So came back to Utah, and I've been here since then. So currently I own a language services company in Utah. I cater to the government and military and also to the church, where I still translate and interpret scripture and non-scripture material. And I'm sort of right now my role is like the managing editor of church translations.
Okay, I heard something about that. So real quick. So are you working on, is there already, or are you working on an Arabic version of the Book of Mormon?
I retranslated it. We had a translation since the 70s, but back in 2012, Elder Holland approved a retranslation. Mm-hmm. So I retranslated it, and it's being released gradually on the website because, it has to go through an ecclesiastical review process. Mm. So a bunch of people would, I gave the translation to the church, and then a bunch of people in the area read the translation, make changes so that it suits everyone there. Okay. So right now, the church has just released the whole book of Alma, so you can find it in the Arabic app. And hopefully by the end of 2024 or sometime in 2024, they'll finish releasing the whole thing. And then I retranslated the Doctrine and Covenants, which will have to go through a similar process. So, yeah.
Well, that's a weighty responsibility. How do you feel about the translation, Jabra?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. So, the old translation was really was great. It was an artistic. It was a piece of literature, but it wasn't faithful to the English Book of Mormon. So I'm very proud that I managed to translate it, retranslate it in a modern language that Arabs across the whole spectrum of the Arab world can understand. Because, we have different dialects. And even though we use modern standard Arabic, the sense we have for words differs across dialects. So it's sort of, you have to negotiate between 17 dialects to get to that one modern standard Arabic that everyone would appreciate and understand.
So here's a quick question then on this. So, the Book of Mormon is basically written in something similar to what we would call Jacobean English.
Yes.
The King James Version that's,
Yes.
400 years old. The Arabic version that you're writing, it's going to be a more modern language?
Yes, okay. So that's another good question. So what the church asked us to do, both me and the Ecclesiastical Review Committee, is to make sure that the language is understandable and is accessible by the modern audiences, but you also stick to that Jacobean spirit whenever possible. So we follow the style of translation called modified literal translation. So it's literal mostly, but you modify it if you get stuck in difficult language.
Okay.
So yeah, but that I can go on and on about that, but that's the gist of it.
Another time, but that's fascinating. Jason, can you give us a quick background on yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Jabra. I'm just so grateful to be with both of you. I'm not speaking on behalf of the United States or on behalf of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but I am a Jewish convert to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm a diaspora Jew, as Jabra said, and as he's a diaspora Palestinian. I was born and raised in Arizona and grew up there. Was raised in Reform Judaism, a more liberal, progressive branch of Judaism, which has influenced my views about Judaism, the Jewish people, and the Arab Palestinian Israeli conflict. When I was 18, I joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but my Jewish identity continued to press upon me and persist. And so there was a period of years where I had dual citizenship with the United States and the state of Israel. And I lived in Israel for a time as an Israeli citizen, and was able to support some Jewish Arab causes. In fact, doing an internship at the Center for Jewish Arab Economic Development, where I actually took American and Canadian Jewish donations and invested them in Arab companies inside Israel. And so I've been that's been my connection to Jewish Palestinian peacemaking. But I do consider myself a Zionist, even though I no longer have Israeli citizenship. But I do believe very much in the existence of a Jewish and democratic state. And I'll just leave it there.
That's awesome. Really appreciate it. Okay. All right. Let's roll right into the conflict here. I want to talk a little more specifically about what the conflict is. And, I feel that oftentimes I'll watch a clip or something, a news clip, or listen to someone talking about the conflict, and we kind of talk up here without a lot of people understanding, I think, some of the fundamentals of what leads us to this point. Jabra, is this more a land dispute between Israel and the Palestinians, or is it more of an ideological, theological struggle?
That is a great question, Greg. So there are layers. So it's not the whole Palestinian Israeli thing isn't a binary issue. It might have started as such, but it no longer is. So to understand that, I mean, I'll try to give you a quick answer here to this. So when the state of Israel was declared, so when the United Nations did the partition plan in 1948, it was all about land. You had the Jews, of Europe, and you had the Jews of the Middle East. And the Jews of the Middle East, not many people talk about. That we had in different Arab countries like Iraq, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, endogenous Jewish populations in the hundreds of thousands. And starting in the 30s, there were pogroms against them in those countries where they were persecuted. And unfortunately, nobody talks about that a lot, but those people in the 30s started being pushed out of those countries, or sometimes being held prisoners in those countries.
So real quick, let me interject real quick, Joe. Yeah. Sorry. So some people don't understand that, right? When the Jews were taken into Babylon, right? This is the time of Lehi.
Yes.
They stayed. There's actually very few people that came back from Babylon and came back to Jerusalem. It was a small, I think they say 44,000, something like that. It's actually right in the Bible.
Yes.
Most of the Jews stayed in Babylon. The Persians, today's Iranians, right? They conquer Babylon, and now the large Persian world is accessed by the Jewish population in Babylon.
Yes.
So they are in the diaspora that has always been out in that area since that time.
Yes.
With these Jewish populations. And then, as you say, all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but, in the earlier part of the 20th century, there's some changes that are made.
Yeah, and they are looking for refuge. And even in the times of Muhammad, you had Jewish Arab tribes living in Medina, and there were three big, massive tribes that unfortunately were basically killed off by the Muslims in Medina as a part of the Muslim Mecca, wars of the period. So you have all of these Jews. So you have, culminating in the 40s, you have masses and masses of Jews in the area looking for refuge. And of course, World War II ends, and you have the Jews of Europe looking for refuge, and Palestine to them is the most natural place to be, right? It's their ancestral land. They have connections. They have families. They've been buying land from the Turks in Palestine since the 1800s, and especially since the Basel Zionist Conference in Switzerland. And so you have this situation. So it started as people looking for land, and then you have the Palestinians, you have my people who are living on the land under the Ottoman system. Now, what many people don't talk about too is that under the Ottoman system, it was a feudal system where you had one nobleman who belonged to the Ottoman classes, and he had farmers living on the land and farming the land or working the land, and you had these little parishes, and they were working there, and they were split into what's called the Tanzimat system, where basically every religious minority rules itself by its own laws, but you're all a part of the Ottoman Empire. And that's how it was. So if you had land, you were either given it by the Ottoman or you were leasing it from an Ottoman. And then you had a whole bunch of people living, other Arabs, other Ottoman subjects, living in other parts of the Ottoman Empire who were absentee landlords. And so there was a lot of land transactions, but there was a lot of people like my ancestors, they lived on the land, they worked the land, they farmed the land, but they rarely owned deeds to it, but they lived on it. So, and there wasn't really that sense of identity among people until the Ottomans left. They were defeated in World War I. And that's when you had the French and the British divide the whole region. And, they, of course, called that region, they called what we call now Israel or the West Bank or Gaza, they called that place Palestine, before the establishment of the State of Israel. So up to that point, up to that partition plan, when the United Nations said, okay, the Jews of the world get this part to be their homeland, and the Palestinians get this part, you had land issues. But the biggest mistake that happened, I think, on my end, on the Arab end, is that the partition plan, the Arab leaders rejected the partition plan. They rejected it because to them, this was Muslim land as it was ruled by the Ottomans. So they thought, oh, we're Muslims, so we have to inherit it. And they rejected it and waged the first war. And now you had that war happen, and it resulted in Israel taking even more than the partition plan. Not a lot more, but enough, because there is this idea in Israeli military thinking of establishing buffers between you and the neighbors. And
so Jabra, are you talking about the 6-Day War?
No, not yet. This is 48.
Oh, back in 48, yes.
Yeah, this is 48. And then you have 53, the War of 53, when the British and the French fought against Egypt over the Suez Canal, and Israel participated in that, which, paved the way for the next cycle, which is the 6-Day War, because after 53, you had the Nasser regime in Egypt. And the Nasser regime Gamal Abdel Nasser spent most of his years in the presidency of Egypt agitating for a war against Israel. And understandably, the Israelis would feel threatened, a new nation, still weak, still with old equipment and gear. And, the 6-Day War happened because of that agitation. And Egypt fired the first shot. Israel fired the first shot in the war, but Egypt agitated for it. They closed the Straits of Tiran, and they were planning that war.
Yeah, Israel basically is looking at this. At least the story is that Israelis were looking at this as a preventative measure to stop the war and possible annihilation.
And then they go, and of course, they take over the West Bank, they take over the Golan, they take over the Sinai, again with the idea of a buffer. But the interesting narrative that I started hearing from older Israelis that I talked to is that when they took that land in 67, they had no intention of keeping it. The problem is, and this is my perspective, not many people will agree with it, it's based on my own studies. The problem at the time was that none of the Arab countries, the Egyptians didn't want the people of Gaza, the Jordanians didn't want the Palestinians living in the West Bank because of the Soviet influence. I have uncles who were communists and socialists, and the government of Jordan felt they didn't want that influence. So they never went back and said to the Israelis, let's negotiate about this, let's have a peace agreement. They just decided, okay, we're not going to do anything. We'll just keep this state of tension and war, and let's have the Israelis manage this. And that's where what we call the occupation ensued. The historical circumstances. So now you have more than the land issue, because now you have Jerusalem, you have Israel building settlements, of course, in the West Bank, which those settlements, if you look at the 1948 partition, those settlements are against the 1948 partition accords. But they are building settlements. And now you're having a very complicated situation. Then you have the 1973 war, which ends up in more blood, but it resulted in one good thing. The 1973 war is that with the defeat, it was sort of a semi-win for the Egyptians, but it was more of a defeat than a win, and it ended up with Egypt having the peace treaty. And this way, the Palestinians lose like the biggest sort of ally or a strong Arab country standing by them. So now you're having all of these layers added to the conflict, and then we have the Oslo Accords in 1990, which again, the complicated things in the sense that both Israel and the United States again, this is a perspective that's contrary to what any Palestinian would tell you, but that's my perspective. The biggest mistake was bringing Arafat and the PLO to the West Bank and Gaza, because what should have happened at the time, and this is something I've believed in since 1991, what should have happened at the time is negotiating peace with the people who are already living in the West Bank and Gaza and keeping the PLO out of it. But the PLO comes in and they rule the region, they rule the area pretty much like any Arab government rules. They come in, you have this hierarchy. The hierarchy keeps the aid, keeps the gains, rules in a corrupt manner. And of course, the government of Israel also made mistakes there, which were sort of using because that was the idea, I believe, was using the PLO as the police to police the West Bank.
Yeah.
And of course, the building of the settlements didn't end. And so now we have this complicated issue. It's land, and then it evolved recently in the last 10 years or so. It has evolved into more of a religious conflict. Like, as a Palestinian Christian, I look at it, I see more of the Islamic, jihadi symbolism, ideas overtaking the conflict, to where the Palestinian Christians are marginalized and find themselves, the ones on the inside living in the West Bank and Gaza, they find themselves forced, I feel, to not come out and speak frankly about the situation. So that is, as we see now, you have all of these Palestinian churches issuing calls for ceasefire, but they don't mention the Israeli hostages, and they don't dare speak against either Hamas or the PLO, because they will be threatened. Their existence will be threatened.
Yeah, well, especially since Hamas came in 2006. To me, it's turned much more ideological, much more religious, much less about the land. Hamas is very difficult, as I've followed it, it's hard to separate Hamas from like an ISIS. It's basically, we want a global caliphate. This is about religion. And not only do we want Israel completely gone, as the chants go out in the U.S. on the campuses of from the river to the sea.
Exactly.
That is getting rid of Israel, right? This is like all of the vocabulary. And, in the past, I've done my share of river to the sea and free Palestine and all of that. But then, a few years ago, I did my PhD and I started studying this in more depth and looking at it in more depth. And Jason and I talked about this a lot. What on our end, I think, and we'll probably talk about this some more, the Israeli people are a people who need two things for this, I believe, to move forward. And this is would be very easy for the Arabs to give to them, which is one, the recognition of Israel's right to exist as a country within its own geography, within its own, institutions, ruling as they wish. They need that self-determination because of not just the Holocaust, but also because of the pogroms that were committed against the Jewish people, both in the Arab world and outside of the Arab world. This trauma runs deep in Jewish psyche and Israeli psyche. And when you look at it through their eyes, they have an absolute right to not trust anyone in the world after what happened to the Jewish people. I mean, this is like a 3,000-year saga where they are persecuted across. So when you come out and you give any hint that you don't want them to exist, it doesn't matter. You have Arab American politicians coming out and saying, oh, when we say river to the sea, we mean one state coexisting, side to side in peace. When you look at it from the Israeli point of view, well, first you look at the state of the Arab states. In the Arab states, there are no equal rights. Like, it's so far in 70 plus years of Arab independence, since all of these countries became independent countries, there is no equality or coexistence like you're talking about. For example,
you look at Jordan. We look at Jordan and we think Jordan is a stable, peaceful, etc. country. But you look on the inside, there are four classes of people in Jordan. There is the native Jordanian. Then class number two is Christian Jordanian. And when I say Jordanian, I mean someone from a native Jordanian tribe or family. And then you have the Muslim Palestinian. And then finally and last, Christian Palestinian. When you're a Mormon Christian Palestinian in Jordan, you're at the bottom of the bottom. Mm-hmm. So when Israelis look at that and they say, okay, a river to the sea, living next to each other, neighbors, one state, but you've proven so far in 70 plus years of independence in your own countries, you don't even do that amongst yourselves. Right? There is this system. So how can we trust that we can live with you river to the sea? Right? So what
Jabra, let me go over to Jason here real quick, just for a second.
Yeah, Jason, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay. So Jason, you've got, according to what Jabra is saying here, you know, it started off a little bit more as a land issue. It's moved more and more into an ideological and theological issue. I want to put another explosive thing in here, I think, which is you say you're a Zionist, right?
Yes.
So when that's added into the picture, I want you to explain what you mean by that.
Yeah.
And how that might be, let's say, triggering to the Palestinians and to others.
Yeah. So first of all, there is secular Zionism and there is religious Zionism. Mm-hmm. And there's also, so to look at it from that point, but then there's also revisionist Zionism and labor Zionism. Okay. And so let me introduce it and then I'll explain kind of where I fit. I'll put it, you know, to entice everyone. I would consider myself a religious labor Zionist. So I'll explain what that means. First of all, in Judaism, but also in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which we can get to, right? It is a commandment of the Torah, of the 5 books of Moses, of the revelation given at Mount Sinai, and also the covenant between God and the Jewish people. It's a religious commandment to live and settle in the land of Israel. The first person to do it was Abraham, from a Jewish point of view, right? Abraham is over in what is now modern day Iraq, the Ur of the Chaldees, and Abraham receives a commandment by God to go to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and you shall be a blessing. And so Abraham picks up his family and all of his resources, and he moves to Beersheba, and he buys some land, and he settles there, and he raises his family, and he buries his wife Sarah in Hebron, which is where we get the cave of Machpelah, the cave of the patriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their spouses are buried there, and so Abraham is the first one to follow this commandment to settle in the land. Of course, there's an exile, and then Moses. You've got Joseph and Moses come back. The Exodus is all about coming back to the land that Abraham initially settled in. So, from a religious obligation, there is this religious obligation for Jews to settle and live in the land of Israel. From a prophetic perspective, right? There's this idea that the Jewish people must immigrate and return to the land of Israel in the latter days. As Latter-day Saints, we believe this. It's very clear in Joseph Smith and Orson Hyde, and also many other presidents of the church. So there's this gathering and return. But from my point of view, when you have immigrants, you can't just have anarchy, right? Immigration, even in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, immigration has to be organized. So there's a Zionist movement that Jabra mentioned that Theodore Herzl created to facilitate Jewish immigration to Israel. And you can't just have anarchy. You can't just rely on, and Jabra did a great job. You've got the Ottoman Empire. It's an empire, okay, is a Muslim empire, pretty moderate Muslim empire compared to what Hamas and ISIS want. And then you have the British Empire, right? And then you have the independent Jewish state. But from a Jewish point of view, the Ottoman Empire could not be trusted to keep Jewish immigrants safe and planted, and neither could the British Empire. There's a whole history of the British limiting, reducing, capping Jewish immigration, and then also allowing all these, the Hebron riots in 1929, allowing indigenous Jews and Palestinians to fight, and then there's also murders of Jews in the land. So you have to have a Jewish state, because you have to have the apparatus of a state to protect and facilitate the Jewish gathering and the Jewish immigration. So
Jason,
that's
quick,
what I mean by Zionist.
Yeah, Jason. So real quick, I mean, you're aware. I'm guessing you're aware that there are a number of people that especially in the church or that are Christian, that go with the narrative of, well, yeah, I believe in the gathering of the Jews, but that doesn't mean I believe in the state of Israel. Right. They completely separate those two things. You're saying they have to be one and the same.
Well, I'm saying that if you believe in the gathering of the Jews, who is going to protect the Jews that are gathered?
Mm-hmm.
The Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, the United States of America? No, it's Jewish self-determination. And that's why I believe that Israel's Declaration of Independence is inspired and wise, because it's creating an apparatus, a structure, an organization that can facilitate and protect the Jewish gathering that Judaism supports, but also Christian Zionism supports. And I'm not saying that in an apocalyptic sense. I'm just saying, if Jews are going to immigrate, how do you facilitate that? You cannot count on other organizations or states to take responsibility for that. And so that it's the necessity of a state of Israel.
Okay. So let me go beyond that real quick. And you're giving very much a theological, I don't know about the labor part yet, but you're giving a theological background to the Zionists. What is the practical point of this? Right? Go beyond that a little bit and say, well, what is the practical issue here? I mean, you're talking about protection. That's a practical issue, right? But because here's what happens, right? You have people that say that use Zionist in a very pejorative manner.
Mm-hmm. They do,
right? Very pejorative manner. You're saying you're a Zionist. What is the secular point of view?
Yeah.
For Zionism, if it's not theological, if it's not about Abraham, if it's not about the promised land, what is the secular point of view for this?
Right. So that's
and why is anti-Semitism so directly tied to that word? Because it is
absolutely
Zionism.
Right. So I put God first, right? Put the kingdom of God first, and then let all these things shall come to you. So now I can focus on the secular. And that is really the debate between revisionist Zionism and labor Zionism. Okay, and this really came by with two leading figures, Ze'ev Jabotinsky in revisionist Zionism, and his kind of protege was Menachem Begin, and also Benjamin Netanyahu, the Likud party. There's a genealogy of revisionist Zionism. And then there's Theodore Herzl, and there's David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, maybe Yair Lapid he's a bit more moderate, but there's this idea there are Zionists who call for two states for two people, right? And that's a little bit more in the history of labor Zionism and accepting partition, which Jabra alluded to. So this debate, we're just talking secular and historical. There in 1922, the League of Nations, the entire League of Nations at the time, voted and supported a mandate for Palestine. They assigned the British to supervise it, and that was the entire land, from the river to the sea. And it's very clear in that legal document that entire land was going to be for a Jewish homeland. And then there was also a mandate for Transjordan on the east bank of the Jordan River. So of course, the Zionist movement was excited, trying to after 1922 to try to populate and get as much Jewish immigration to fill this land. The revisionists said, whether we get a majority or we don't get a majority, a Jewish majority, we are going to take claim of this entire British mandate for Palestine. And the Arabs can go over to Transjordan on the East Bank. The labor Zionists said, we really, really want a Jewish and democratic state. So they focused concentrating Jewish immigration in areas where they could build a Jewish majority, because they knew, the labor Zionists always knew that we have to be ready for the possibility of partition. And partition is not a unique thing. The Indians and Pakistanis also had to deal with partition. And it's worthwhile to explore how the Indians and Pakistanis dealt with that. But the labor Zionists were always trying to figure out, how do we have a Jewish and democratic state, and which may necessitate partition, because if you can't get a Jewish majority in certain portions of the historical land of Israel, you may have to partition that to a Palestinian state or an Arab state. And that's why the labor Zionists in 1946, they were willing to accept the United Nations partition plan, and they did. And they just wanted a Jewish and democratic state wherever they could get it. Menachem Begin and those revisionists, they continued on to press for, well, no, we have a claim to the entire land of Israel. So when I say I'm like a religious labor Zionist, I understand, number one, the Jewish people have a claim to the entire land of Israel, because, I mean, Hebron is in the Palestinian Authority, but Hebron, it's where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are buried. So obviously it's a sacred place for Jewish people, but then we get the secular argument of it's got to be a Jewish and democratic state. So should the state of Israel exercise sovereignty over the entire land of Israel? That's where I kind of pull back a little bit, and I look at that.
What do you mean by the entire? What do you mean by the entire land of Israel?
The river to the sea,
okay.
Right? The Jordan River on the east and the Mediterranean on the west. So that's why I'm
including Gaza, including the West Bank.
Right, because the revisionist Zionism will say this entire land of Israel, there's a Jewish claim to it, because Jews have. Even in the 19th century and the 20th century, there were Jews in Hebron. There were Jews Hebron. There were Jews in Gush Etzion, which is in between Jerusalem and Hebron. And then Jerusalem. There's always been Jews in Jerusalem. So revisionist Zionism will say, typically revisionist Zionism will say no to partition. And they will say, we got to keep settling. We got to keep pushing for the entire land.
And that's where you're saying that not Netanyahu would be, ultimately.
Well,
is that
right,
his
Netanyahu
ideal?
he's kind of the bastion of revisionist Zionism.
So he wants river to the sea.
Well, he also accepts, he has, right, that's when he's talking, he's not wanting to annex everything. So he's still working under the framework of the Oslo Accords. And when we talk about the occupation, it's very complicated, right? I see this military occupation, but you've got, and Jabra can talk to this next, right? You've got Area A, Area B, and Area C. Area A is Palestinian Authority, civil and security control. So in Area A, there's mostly Palestinian sovereignty in Area A. There's Area B, which is Palestinian Authority civil control, the judges, the courts, the schools, the civil administration. But then Israel still has some security responsibilities in Area B. And then you have Area C, which is Israeli civil and security control. So when we're talking about occupation, it's extremely complicated. There's actually three different pieces, but this is what the Israel and the Palestinian Authority worked out in the Oslo Accords. And so what Jabra and I are really talking about is updating this, peace process, looking at Area A and Area B and Area C, and seeing how the configuration could be better for Israelis and Palestinians.
Okay. So Jabra,
Yeah.
what do you think about the river to the sea as compared to the partitions?
Well, so as I said, it's impossible right now, just because I believe that the Jews need to see, maybe in 100 years, but not now, because Arabs all over, and again, I'm generalizing. I know
Can this go on for another 100 years?
But as someone who's lived in many Arab countries and lived amongst many Arabs as a diaspora Palestinian, I don't think the Arab mindset is ready to have a society where there is a Jewish or a Christian, I wouldn't say minority, but they wouldn't, as Muslims, they are not capable of accepting rule by Christians or Jews over them. In all Arab countries, the Quran is the basis of the constitutions. And in the Quran, it says, you shall not have a Jew or a Christian above you or ruling over you. So unless there is some major ideological revolution in the Arab world where we believe in equality, representative democracy, freedom of conscience, equality of people before the law, until all of these happen genuinely, we can't have a river to the sea of Jews and Palestinians. So for now, a Jewish state is what needs to happen. And to be honest, the Israeli state has proven to be extraordinary in integrating people from all over the world, including 20% of its population who are Arabs. Now, the situation isn't 100% perfect for those Arabs, but they get equality before the law, they get civil rights, they get to be represented in the Knesset, etc., etc. Now, what Jason was talking about with areas A, B, and C, what happened because of the Oslo Accords, and again, that's because Arafat and the PLO were in a rush in 1990 to have any agreement because, they supported Saddam during the Gulf War. And as a result, all of their financial support was withdrawn from Saudi and Kuwait and all of these Arab countries. And Kuwait expelled basically 300,000 Palestinians. Arafat lost. Like my dad, when we lived in Kuwait, you would pay $50 every month to the PLO. They took it right out of your paycheck. The Kuwaitis did. Whether you wanted it or not. It was one of my dad's pet peeves. So they would take that money, and then all of a sudden that money stopped and he needed something else. And that's why he rushed into Oslo. And the people inside, the Palestinians who lived, like people like Faisal al-Husseini, just to name one, or Hanan Ashrawi, who unfortunately, has lived now in the PLO tank for years, so she can't think different like she used to. Those people would have been perfect to negotiate with Israel and have a stable, democratic, progressive government. But the PLO came in and started this whole situation. Now, they didn't prove in the initial years. Arafat walks in and he starts, when things don't happen immediately as he wanted, even though I think Israel responded at the time under Rabin and the joint Rabin-Peretz presidency or premiership. They responded nicely. They relinquished many areas to Arafat and the PLO in rapid succession. But Arafat wanted things to end really fast. So when they didn't happen his way, he started agitating, the second intifada, the, violence against settlers, and all of these things started happening. So that's where those areas A, B, and C came from. A were those areas that were released first, and then B and C, that Israel said, okay, well, things don't look stable, so we're going to just keep some control over it. And it resulted in the Swiss cheese situation where you don't have one coherent piece of land that you can have sovereignty over or manage effectively. And then, of course, after the second intifada, we had the wall, which added another burden on the Palestinians in terms of managing land. And I would say it was a problem created by the second intifada, which wasn't, in hindsight, it wasn't necessary. So I think right now, and Omar Bertov, and I just saw this a couple of weeks ago, Omar Bertov is a leading Holocaust studies scholar. I forgot where he comes out of, but he's one of the leading scholars on the subject. He was asked, what would you do in this situation? And he gave, especially with all the settlements in the West Bank, he said, I would have a situation where the Palestinians, where you have sovereignty rights and residency rights. So you have a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, where the Palestinians have sovereignty and residency rights, and the Israeli settlers have Israeli citizenship and they're under Israeli jurisdiction, but they have residency in the West Bank. And we deal with the situation until, that gradually move into a situation where people can live together in one state in the West Bank, not in Israel proper. And I like that solution. I liked it. I think, especially after what's happened in the last few weeks, I think both Israelis and Palestinians need a period where they reestablish trust and it's sort of a hard restart for everything. And Palestinians focusing on building their institutions. I think Abbas is finished. Hamas will be finished once Israel is done in Gaza. And there needs to be a hard reset in governance. There needs to be good governance in the West Bank and starting this process of establishing trust with the Israelis. And, I'm sure that if the Israelis feel that they are recognized, that if Palestinians make first steps to make them feel recognized and safe, Israelis will reciprocate. But phrases like river to the sea right now, I just watched a news clip actually right before I talked to you. Some official sitting there giving a statement, and behind him there was a banner: death to America, death to Israel, death to the Jews, Allahu Akbar. Now you look at this from an Israeli point of view and you're seeing this guy talking. How are you going to feel? You're not going to have any goodwill towards this person. So
there's no negotiation with it. How do you have any negotiation with that sentiment?
You can't trust them. You cannot trust them. And that's why there needs to be a hard reset in governance. The Israelis need to stop, and this is a mistake that Israel has made for the last 30 years.
What
is that they used Palestinian differences to sort of divide and conquer, which is, again, understandable. I understand it. I look at it with different eyes than I did 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. But that needs to end. What the Israelis need to say is to say, okay, we're done with the Palestinian Authority. We're finished with Hamas, never with those. And let's look inside Palestine. Let's look at leadership figures who do not belong to the Palestinian authorities, people living there, judges, progressive people, and say, okay, we want you to form the government. We want you to have an election. Let's monitor it, and you elect your own authorities, and let's start this anew. Let's reset it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jason, Jabra was talking about this evolution of this starting off more as a land dispute, moving on to an ideological and religious dispute. From your point of view, what difference do you see? Is there any gap, or how big is the gap between Hamas, who's been there since 2006, and the Palestinian people as a whole? Now, Hamas was voted in, apparently. I don't know exactly what that means, but they were voted in, and they've been. There has not been a vote since in 2006. So it's basically a tyranny, basically, right? I mean, you've got a dictatorship by a party there with Hamas. But what is the difference between Hamas, which is registered as a terrorist organization in the U.S., and the people of Palestine?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Right. So in the 1993 Oslo peace process, we did have the labor Zionism was winning the day. Yitzhak Rabin, the famous prime minister that was assassinated by a fellow Jew, he was a bastion of labor Zionism, but he's also a military commander. So he was all about, number one, Zionism is about Jewish gathering, Jewish return, Jewish immigration, to a set state with secure borders, and with the state of Israel protecting those immigrants that are gathering, and so, but in that process, which was United States led at the time, which United States is always going to have a role in this. And we could talk about that, but the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is the sole, is in legal speak, is the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, right? The Palestinian Liberation Organization, despite the decades of terror that Yasser Arafat inflicted on Israelis, because Yasser Arafat also had embraced the river to the sea, but in the Oslo process, the Palestinian Liberation Organization recognized the existence of the state of Israel, which is what Jabra is saying. It is crucial. The Israeli people, the Jewish people, have no Palestinian partner unless the Palestinian partner accepts the state of Israel's existence. That's number one. So you can't do anything with Hamas, because Hamas, you can't do anything. So part of American has got to be, how do you build up a Palestinian consensus that will just accept Israel's right to exist? And there's different ways to do that, and that's the goal.
It's possible then?
Absolutely.
Is that possible?
It's absolutely, in the Oslo process, the gears were working, because you had the PLO recognize Israel, and you had labor Zionism leading the way. But then, as Jabra said, you had the Second Intifada, which Hamas came in those days. Hamas came in and was responsible for over 3/4 of the murders. Hamas upset the peace process and started just murdering indiscriminately Israeli civilians. And they upset, and guess what happened to Israeli politics? The labor Zionists lost, and the revisionist Zionists and the right wing came into power, and they've been there ever since. And that's what Israeli politics is responding to movements within the Palestinian the Palestinian Authority and the PLO. So if we've got to have the PLO and the Palestinian Authority have got to be dominated by those who accept Israel's right to exist. That has got to happen, because that would also moderate Israeli politics, and you could get back to that sweet spot of where you had Yitzhak Rabin, who was willing to work through the Oslo process. I believe the Oslo process is all we have, and we have to revive it. But you've got to have a trustworthy Palestinian Authority to like Jabra saying, to build the trust on the Israeli side, so we had people like Tzipi Livni. Tzipi Livni kept saying 2 states for 2 people. She used to be a revisionist, but then she accepted, well, maybe we, I mean, I could get into all the intricacies of this, but those are the partners that can actually make this happen.
So, Jason, let's say there was a two-state solution, right? Let's say it came to that and it started to get momentum, right? Is that a possibility for Israel to exist in a two-state solution? In other words, originally, I know that part of the Israel's grab, especially of Gaza, was because of military issues where they feared Egypt, right? And coming in across above on Gaza, they were afraid of that terrain and the ability of Egypt to attack in that area. Is there a possibility where you could say, okay, well, we can give up these areas to an absolute sovereignty to these areas and still feel as if we are safe?
Well, that's why October 7th is so dangerous, because it's so undermining, because Israel in 2005, Ariel Sharon, who was a revisionist, right? Ariel Sharon was Jabotinsky and Menachem Begin. Ariel Sharon said, I'm going to unilaterally disengage from Gaza. And he pulled out all Israeli military, and he pulled out all Israeli civilian settlers. He pulled out the state of Israel's apparatus out of Gaza and said, okay, we're going to let Gaza is going to be Area A, right? And if we need to think in that way. And then what happened? Hamas won. Hamas started importing dual-use materials and also weapons. I mean, how does Hamas still have rockets after more than 40 days of war? So Hamas just immediately turned to war making instead of peacemaking. And so that was a failure, right? Ariel Sharon, he thought, and so that's why this is so complicated, because, and then October 7th, there is a border. Israel does have a border between Israel and Gaza, and Hamas terrorists penetrated the border and murdered Israelis in their sleep. So Israelis are really worried about that. There's no trust, right? Even though we have this vision of two states for two peoples, how is Israel going to have secure borders? I think many Israelis would like to have secure borders, but you've got to negotiate with a trustworthy Palestinian partner so that we can figure out the borders between the two peoples.
Jabra, go ahead. You had something to say?
Yeah. So let me. There is a lot of comments here. So first of all, about the Palestinians and Hamas. So it's really interesting, because Gaza, before Hamas, was one of the most progressive, liberal parts of the Palestinian areas. And it's a mystery of mysteries how Islamic radicalism took hold there. I've read so many things about it, and I still can't figure out how that happened. But like the whole Palestinian-Israeli thing is also an accumulation of things. And that's why I'm more focused on the future and the current situation. How can we resolve it rather than looking at the history? Because you look at the history and there are layers and layers that complicate understanding. So, and it's sort of like, what's first, the chicken or the egg, right? So you can look at what Hamas did or what the PLO did, and then you talk to other Palestinians who live in areas A and B and C and in Gaza, and they would say, but, we have the settlers coming in and burning our trees. There are cases of settlers coming and burning babies in their homes. And there are cases of settlers coming in and, like, just this last harvest, they prevented the Palestinians from harvesting their olives, which is the main source of income for most people in the West Bank. And then you have, for example, Israel to make sure to when they want a lead from someone, let's say they think you have a lead and you're not going to talk, they go and they arrest your child. And I've seen videos and pictures of 3-year-old children being arrested by the IDF so that they force their parents to turn themselves in and give information. And so you have all of these layers that cause anger. And of course, you have the wall. I'm sure you've seen pictures of Palestinians going through cages. Like in Bethlehem, for example. So I told you my family is from Beit Jala. And Bethlehem, my cousins and I used to go to it and walk, like it's a 15 minutes walk, right? Now it takes you to walk it takes you over 2 hours. So people who lived very close can't go and visit each other because of the wall and because of the security fences. And on one hand, yes, it is terrible, and I see it from the Palestinian living inside's point of view, but I also see it from an Israeli point of view. Well, are you going to come in and start stabbing people or running over people with your car or throwing rocks or? So again, chicken and egg, which comes first? Who started this? In the end, to me, it doesn't matter. I think, to me, the best solution is for Palestinians to, because it's my side of things, is to take radical responsibility and say, what can we do, regardless of who started this, regardless of what the settlers are doing, regardless of what the government of Israel, who is in power, is doing. Let's take radical responsibilities and look at what we can do to improve the situation. And my beef is that violence has not worked. Palestinians, probably more than any nation that resisted, in history, have used all forms of violence. I can go through a long list of violence that's terroristic, non-terroristic, and it has not worked. All methods of agitation has not worked, and it just made the situation worse. And this is a time when we need to think out of the box laterally. And to me, that thinking is, let's build relations of trust with our Israeli neighbors. Let's be the ones to make take that step first. Let's be the ones who are healing bombs and speaking peace and building that relationship without even expecting reciprocity. You don't do it because you expect reciprocity. You do it to basically, in our LDS language, to show a mighty change of heart. You have to be convinced to do it.
Personal responsibility.
Personal responsibility. How can the Palestinian Authority fix the economy? How can you build a system with justice for all, equality before the law, freedom of conscience, freedom of worship, freedom of speech? Just the other day, and I don't say this to beat on the Palestinians. I'm not in their shoes, living in those difficult conditions. But you watch a video of them arresting at the Aqsa Mosque, arresting this young kid. They put a trash can over his head. They beat him and extract a confession from him that he is a spy for Israel, and then they execute him. And to me, that was the epitome of what's wrong with the Palestinian side of things. Now, in my thinking, okay, fine. You found a spy, you take him before a court, you give him a lawyer, you have a constitution, you have laws, prove your case against him, behave as if you are a civilized society, not as if you're a mafia state, Behave like that. And then the Israelis would look at this and say, oh, okay, they have rules. They are orderly people. And that's what the Israelis are not seeing now. The Israelis look on the other side and they see billions and billions of dollars that came to Arafat and to Mahmoud Abbas and the PLO. And any Palestinian who's speaking honestly to you would, like Palestinians amongst themselves, they would acknowledge this. It's a government of thieves. And Israelis look at that and say, well, it's a government of thieves. We can't trust them. How can we trust they will provide how can they be honest with us if they are not honest amongst themselves? If all of this money and assistance coming in isn't used to build them up, right? So that's what needs to happen. And just to let you know, I've pulled up a couple of surveys. Even with what's happening now, 50% of Palestinians don't believe. Let me see here. So a poll conducted in October in 2023 by the Washington Institute, the majority of Gazans were against breaking a ceasefire with Israel, and 70% of Gazans supported a proposal for the Palestinian Authority taking charge. More than 50%, where is that 50%? Agreed that Hamas should stop calling for Israel's destruction and accept a permanent two-state solution based on the 1967 borders. So, I mean, there is still 50% who are against that, but 50% is a good place to start. And that's what we need. That's what we need to build on. Now, I'm going to track back, Greg, and I'm so sorry, just before I forget it.
No, go ahead.
So regarding Zionism, and Jason it's his field, he did a brilliant job, but let me add a couple of things about it. Zionism is a nationalistic movement. It's a product of the late 19th, early 20th century when people were building nations. I mean, it's like Italian nationalism. I mean, there was nothing called Italy until until Metternich established the Italian unity, and there was a country called Italy. Germany, the same thing. And Zionism is a nationalistic movement that wanted a national homeland for the Jews. And I've read Herzl, and I actually find Herzl very good to read because he talks about a state of Jews, Arabs living together, farming the land, working together. That was the original vision. It wasn't necessarily a colonial settler, in the lingo of today, a colonial settler movement. It was, hey, we want to start the land that will have Jews and Arabs in it, and where we have self-determination. So, and it pains me to say this. Because, again, radical honesty and self-responsibility. I grew up in Kuwait, and I grew up with, some of the most popular books were Mein Kampf and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is what my generation growing up was reading, most popular books. And the word Zionist was used as pejorative cuss word. You wanted to even call another Arab, or you see another Arab and you think he's bad, you call him a Zionist. And it's not based it's based basically in anti-Semitism. It's not based on an understanding of what the Zionist movement is. Now, you have Zev Jabotinsky, you have those people, they had more of a colonial settler perspective on things, but the majority of the Zionist movement was of the Theodor Herzl mode of things, which is, a binational sort of state where Jews have self-determination and they are safe within borders.
Jabra, what are your thoughts? I mean, moving outside of Israel and Palestine, moving to the United States, where you have, and other parts of the West, where you have, especially on the campuses, from the river to the sea, and you have, to me, I look at this, I don't see how anyone can look at those rallies, listening to what the people are saying, and seeing the hashtag Free Palestine from the river to the sea, and not understand that underlying all of this is a complete eradication of Israel movement and anti-Semitism.
Yes.
I mean, I can understand you can have, there are certainly issues with any state. There's issues with Israel. It's like they've made mistakes. They do. You brought up some points there where, I had another Palestinian on last week on the show, and some things that she grew up with where it was very uncomfortable and she didn't agree with it, and I understand that. I get that, right? But this, to me, it's a phenomenon that we have, especially in academia in the U.S., where there is this movement of anti-Semitism that is, I think even the settler colonial aspect of that is a mask for anti-Semitism. Why would this exist? Why does this happen?
Yeah, so it's a dilemma for me. It's been for the last month and a half to understand this, especially from Arab American students on American campuses going to Ivy League schools. I can't fathom it. And I've started seeing it in Twitter or X videos. I've started seeing it on Facebook. The whole dialogue is started becoming non-compromising, non-tolerant. It's very emotional. Of course, it's driven by what's happening in Gaza, but it's become very distressing when online and social media, and I'm a qualitative researcher. I look at people's words, I look at what people project online and videos and iconography and that sort of stuff. And it's been, the word to it is disgusting. I've seen Arabs posting like Nazis in Nazi Germany would, like caricatures about gassing Jews, using Nazi symbols, and it is heart-wrenching, very disappointing, and non-excusable. I cry for the children of Gaza. I just mourn for them. It breaks my heart. But I would never allow myself to be so angry, to be blinded and sink into that abyss and cesspool and embracing Nazi ideas. Now, here is and I wrote about this, and I wrote in a manner that is kind of sharp and sarcastic. But Jews shouldn't, and I say this, and hopefully you'll understand the context, shouldn't fear this Arab anti-Semitism, because and I wrote this, I said, it took the industrial might of Nazi Germany to try and do something, and they did not succeed. And Arabs right now are in such a state, they can't even produce their own bicycle, let alone, produce, gas chambers to eradicate Jews or anything like that. So the Jews of the world are safe. But the problem is those feelings. It is, in Book of Mormon lingo, these are the creeds that people in the Book of Mormon chose not to write about. These are the things that remained hidden, that they didn't want to spread or mention. And it's because they are dangerous. They are germs. Those ideas are like germs, and they are worse than any plague.
Yeah.
Because
virus, yeah.
I mean, I can't believe that people would use that. Like, you refuse to see the humanity in this other person, no matter what you thought of that person. To talk about gassing them, to make fun of something so serious and so sad and disgusting as the Holocaust, and to inflict that on people. I don't care what your cause is. And so the students on campuses are baffling. And the other phenomena that has been distressing to me is seeing Arab demonstrators, resorting to violence in the United States. I've seen some videos of demonstrators, pro-Palestine demonstrators, removing the American flag, doing things like that. That shouldn't be the case. And so it's just distressing.
All right, Jason.
But condemn it, Greg.
Yes, appreciate that. Jason, how should we be looking at this as Latter-day Saints? You guys are both Latter-day Saints. You've both got a good knowledge about the conflict, what's going on. Jabra, you just brought up some parallels with the Book of Mormon, which I think are very apt. How should we be looking at this as Latter-day Saints? I see in this not only parallels to the Book of Mormon, but what is the Christian approach to this? And regardless of whether you look at oppressor and victim in this situation, when you do not give the victim the chance to have personal responsibility and to grow and to learn as well, I think you are condemning them in a sense. You are condemning them to a lack of growth and production in their lives. And so for me, real quick, for me, the Latter-day Saint approach is on both sides. It is not just okay, Israel's got the power and they can control this. It is, no, you always have personal responsibility. You always have the ability to make changes in a culture or to make changes in yourself. What do you see as the Latter-day Saint approach And how should we look at this as Latter-day Saints?
Yeah, no, thank you, Greg. And you're touching on it, and Jabra's touched on it. Number one, I think, we must view all people, Israelis and Palestinians, as children of God, as created in the image of God. So we have to recognize the dignity of each human being, and that each human being is a child of heavenly parents and Adam and Eve. So starting from there, historically, right, Jabra hinted at this, the Zionist movement, when Theodor Herzl started it in 1897, immediately the Jewish, the Zionist organization, later became the Jewish Agency for Israel, built all of the institutions for a Jewish and democratic state. There's an economic organization called the Histadrut, which was like this national labor union. They built militias, the Haganah, which later became the Israel Defense Forces. They built an education system. They built agricultural system, right? They built an industry, the kibbutzim, self-sustaining, self-reliant institutions. That is what the Zionist movement did. Just like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints did in Utah, right? I mean, we could go back and we could call the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints a settler colonial movement. We could go there if we want. That's my warning to Latter-day Saint anti-Zionists if you want to go there. The Zionist movement is an indigenous, liberation movement, but also a state-building movement. And I know that there are Palestinians that see that, and they've seen the democracy that Israel has. They've seen the state building. The problem is that Hamas hijacked a large portion of the Palestinian people, and Hamas is only a terrorist organization. That's it. They have said they do not want to build a state. They do not want to take care of the Palestinian people. They only exist to wage war on Jews. They've said that. They're not ashamed. So what we need, from a Latter-day Saint point of view, if we really want to help the Palestinian people, which we should because they're children of God, is we should help the Palestinian people build a functioning, peaceful, prosperous state. It's going to have to be peaceful. It's going to have to start as entirely demilitarized. I would love to see a day when a state of Israel and a state of Palestine could defend themselves from Iran. But because Iran is an existential threat, Jabra didn't mention this, but an Iranian nuclear weapon is a big gas chamber that is meant to kill Jews and also kill Palestinians. So instead of letting the Iranians into the Palestinian bubble, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad have just welcomed Iran in, they should reject that, and a state of Israel and a state of Palestine could work together for peace, prosperity, goodness, and they could, build what we consider to be Zion together. And that's why Jabra and I are able to talk, because we have this idea of Zion of peace, prosperity, and righteousness that we want to build in both of our peoples.
That's going to be pretty tough to get Iran out of that, right? I mean, because they're not going to want to lose that edge.
Yes.
It's the same idea with Hezbollah up north, right? They're not going to want to lose that edge. The timing of this October 7th is right when Saudi Arabia was coming in and looking like they were going to be signing to the Abraham Accords.
Right.
It's the same thing. It's like, no, we don't want this. We don't want the peace there. And especially Iran, who is a rival to Saudi Arabia. It's like that. I don't think that is a coincidence.
No,
the timing of this happened when it did.
And Greg, you see, and I told Jason this before a few times, I wish on October 8th, the situation was completely different, because the best opportunity for peace in the whole Middle East, I believe, was on October 8th, if people were willing to think out of the box, which is on October 8th, the Israeli military surrounds Gaza, cuts them off, maybe hit some selected Hamas targets, but call the Saudis and say, call the Islamic League, call the Gulf Cooperation Council, here is the Abrahamic Accords. All of you recognize the state of Israel's right to exist. And basically, we will take a different course of action that doesn't involve full-blown attack on Gaza. And I'm willing to bet the Arab states would have responded because everyone knew, every Palestinian in the world on October 7th knew what the response would exactly be like, including Hamas. They were counting on it. And the way to disrupt their plan and to disrupt the Iranian plan would have been taking that course. But as Jason would point, Israel has a right to defend itself. They are a government elected by people who expect it to behave a certain way, and something like that, probably the people, in the evening of October 7th wouldn't have approved of. But that would have been the best opportunity for peace, right there and then. And you would have had all of those GCC countries basically signing up. I'm almost certain of it. But when we talk about, a Latter-day Saint approach for peace, I rely on three things. First, there is this statement from President Kimball from his bicentennial speech in 1976, the 200 years of the United States. He said something interesting, and I think he meant it about humans in general, not just America. But he said, "We are a warlike people, easily distracted from our assignment of preparing for the coming of the Lord. When enemies rise up, we commit vast resources to the fabrication of God's stone and steel, ships, planes, missiles, fortifications, and depend on them for protection and deliverance. When threatened, we become anti-enemy instead of pro-kingdom of God." And this is like, I underline this with thick red lines. We become anti-enemy instead of pro-kingdom of God. We train men in the art of war, a man in the art of war, and call him a patriot, thus in the manner of Satan's counterfeit of true patriotism, perverting the Savior's teaching, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, etc. So the first step, a Latter-day Saint approach based on just this line, is to say, okay, what can we do? And of course, Muslims and Jews will not think pro-kingdom of God, right? But this is the Latter-day Saint view of things. If Jason and I were representing the Palestinian Israeli side, that's how we'll probably look at it. Don't think anti-enemy. Don't look at Jason and think Zionist enemy or settler colonial or river to the sea. Think, what is best to build the kingdom of God? What would the Savior want this relationship to be like? And, President Nelson, a couple of conferences ago, told us what that relationship should be like. We should have dialogue. We should talk. We should not resort to contention. It's very simple. And that's one reason I choose to appear with Jason when we talk about this, because I want to model to Arab Latter-day Saints how this dialogue can go within the framework of the gospel, that we can sit down and talk about this, and we can find or suggest solutions to it from a Latter-day Saint perspective. Now, the Book of Mormon gives us two cases, and these are my favorite things, my favorite platform. And that is, one, there is a story of the Alma the Elder and the people of Limhi. If you remember, those were the people of Noah, and they move with Alma. They are going to Zarahemla, and on the way they settle this land, and the priests of Noah and the Lamanites control them. And for a period of time, the priests of Noah prevent them from praying, prevent them from doing anything. And the command that the Lord gives to the people of Alma is, bear your burdens with peace, pray in your hearts. Do not use violent resistance. Do not do any resistance at all. Continue working. And the second one is the famous case of the anti-Nephi Lehis. They just were sick of bloodshed. They were sick of killing others. They bury their weapons and they say, we're not going to say a word to these people. We're just going to kneel and surrender to them and let the work of death, as the words of the Book of Mormon, let the work of death happen if needs be, but we're not shedding blood anymore. And that is radical peacemaking. And people look at that and they say, that is not useful. That is not practical. Because your enemy might come in and your enemy might be Hitler, and then you will kill 6 million Jews, right? But at some point that enemy will stop because they will be sickened by it, and they will either come to your side or they will stop and they will leave you alone. Because no human, and that's how, by the way, speaking of Iran, that was Ayatollah Khomeini's tactic against the Shah of Iran in 1978. He basically asked his people to march against the soldiers of the Shah and just be shot at. And the soldiers of the Shah kept shooting, and then they finally decided they've had enough and joined with the revolution and turned to Khomeini's side. It's just human nature. So, I used to believe, okay, we need to boycott, divest, and sanctions. And then I realized there is a long anti-Semitic history of boycotts, economic boycotts against Jews. And that doesn't play well. That antagonizes Jews. So when I say weapons of war, in this case, I'm saying nothing. You do nothing. You focus inside, you try to build yourself, you take responsibility for your own situation, and you say, what can I do within what I have to build peace? And you start there. But the key to it is starting with dialogue. And I would say, find the Jew and be their friend. Your perspective will change. Currently one of my best friends in the world is an ultra-Orthodox settler rabbi in Israel. And I talk to him on the phone several times a week, and it started as an interest in translation, interest in Torah, and it evolved into a friendship. And, I love the man. And, that's how you start seeing things from the other point of view, is friendship, talking together, peace.
It's a great point. I really appreciate the words from both of you. I think this has been very effective. I think it's very informative. Love having both of you on. I hope we can do this again. And if this conflict continues, which it looks like it will, maybe there will be some other perspectives and angles that we can speak on. Is there anything you want to finish off with very quickly before we're done, either of you?
I just say thank you to Jabra. Jabra is a profile in moral and religious courage. And it is important to hold to the doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's one thing I'm very worried about, because the prophet Joseph Smith and Orson Hyde, they wanted a Jewish state to happen. I mean, the Orson Hyde prayed for a distinct nation and government. That does not preclude the existence of a Palestinian state or any other Arab state. But the idea was that the Jewish people should have a national home. And that's part of our doctrine. It's part of the gathering of Israel. And I want to see a way that is fair for Jews and for Palestinians. And that's why I'm just so grateful to Jabra for his scholarship and his compassion for the Jewish people. It has to start with purging oneself of the anti-Semitism. But also on the Jewish side, I condemn Meir Kahane. He's passed away, but there's this whole idea of Kahanism, which is very anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian. And I reject that, because I don't think it's true to the doctrines that Jews and Christians hold dear, which is that every single human being is in the image of God. And so we have to find a way to honor that and not denigrate anyone. So I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, and Greg, I just want to say, many people will watch this, and if they are pro-Palestinian or they are Palestinians, they would say, there will be a backlash personally because what I'm saying is considered high treason, right? But I'm not afraid of it. Here is why. Palestinians have tried everything, as I said, and I think it's time to try something new. It's time to reach out. I feel bad for the people of Gaza, the civilians, the children. I know Israel made mistakes. Jason would agree with me. As I said, there is the children's arrest, there is the wall, there is, all of these things. But to dwell on all of that stuff, you're going to sit in a circle and you're going to be continually blinded by hate and rage. Again, in the Book of Mormon, it talks about the traditions of the fathers, the stories that the fathers, the Lamanites, were taught to hate the Nephites. And I think the best way to get the Palestinians to have progress is to get rid of this mindset. I want to read you one quick quote, if I can, from Abraham Lincoln. I was driving along the Pacific coast yesterday and listening to the radio, and this quote from Abe Lincoln, who happens to be one of my heroes. He says, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." And I was driving, and I looked at my wife, and I said, "Find me this quote, because that is what I want to tell every Palestinian. It's time to have new thoughts and new thinking, and and I think love and peace and loving our Jewish brothers and sisters is the key to that."
Great. Appreciate both of you. Let's make sure we do this again.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And we need to talk the Book of Mormon if you want.
Will do. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Greg.